the future of medical education. I'm David Rancourt. I'm the Vice Provost and VP of Enrollment Management at New College. I want to first thank the Global Liberty Institute for their partnership on this event. And of course, I want to thank Ling and Michael Markovitz for their continued generosity and support that makes the Socratic stage possible. Nearly all cultures hold medical doctors in the highest regard. Both real and fictional medical professionals have captivated Americans for generations. We all know Dr. Jonas Salk for his development of the polio vaccine. And of course, there's Dr. Marcus Welby and Dr. House. In the past several years, medical doctors have gained a significant amount of attention as public policy debates have raged in America over policies and procedures relating to COVID-19, DEI in medicine, and transgender care. Two men at the tip of the spear in these debates are here with us tonight. For many reasons, both have attained celebrity status, extending far beyond the field of medicine. We're honored tonight to have Dr. Stanley Goldfarb and Dr. Scott Atlas. Dr. Goldfarb has had a long and distinguished career as a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. His NIH funding and research on kidney disease and other works has led to over 250 published articles and reviews and citations on top medical journals. He also served as the Associate Dean of Curriculum at University of Penn Medical School. Following his departure from Penn, Dr. Goldfarb was appointed to the board of Old Dominion University's medical school by Governor Glenn Youngkin. Dr. Goldfarb has founded a group called Do No Harm, embracing the 2,500-year-old Hippocratic Oath, and also published a book called Take 2 Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns. I'll let you determine whether or not that organization and those publications led to the Virginia Senate deciding not to confirm his appointment to the Old Dominion Medical School. Dr. Scott Atlas is a former commencement speaker and no stranger to New College. Dr. Atlas is a radiologist, a healthcare policy advisor, and a well-known commentator. He is a senior fellow in healthcare policy at the Hoover Institute and think tank at Stanford University. In 2020, President Trump named Dr. Atlas to the White House Coronavirus Task Force, where his common sense medical recommendations often conflicted with others in the scientific community, and particularly with Dr. Anthony Fauci. In hindsight, Dr. Atlas's recommendation on children, COVID-19, masks, and lockdowns have proven to be particularly discerning. Doctors, welcome to the Socratic stage.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and delighted to be here. Good evening, everybody. We have a very interesting conversation tonight, a fascinating conversation with Dr. Stanley Goldfarb that, as was mentioned, is co-sponsored by Global Liberty Institute and New College. First, I want to thank everyone at New College, especially the supporters of the series, as well as President Corcoran for hosting this forum, and Alexandra Islas for working so hard on preparing the event. I think everybody should give her a round of applause. Just briefly, 2.5 years ago, I co-founded this Global Liberty Institute, which is an independent, international, and nonpartisan initiative for promoting individual and economic liberty and the free exchange of ideas. Freedom, of course, should never be a partisan issue, but apparently it is now. The core of GLI is its Rising Leaders program, which is dedicated to identifying and nurturing young rising stars in early careers in private and public sectors, educating them and directly connecting them to senior established leaders. Through this, we accelerate their careers to populate private and public institutions with the next set of leaders who champion individual and economic freedom. The broad goal of this symposium, I think everyone knows, and the shared vision of both Global Liberty Institute and New College of Florida, is the profound commitment to restoring the free exchange of ideas, the civil discussion of complex issues, to inform, to generate debate, to arrive at solutions, but to me, most importantly, to educate our children. It's not just about specific individual topics, of course. It's about critical thinking. And as I said in my remarks at the graduation a couple of years back, which I think if you were there, you probably remember that experience, critical thinking is the most important lesson that we can teach in college. And critical thinking is literally impossible without hearing different views, especially views you may not agree with. The title of this event tonight is The Politics of Medicine, Who Controls the Future of Medical Education? But it's about, of course, more than medical education per se. It's about one of the most important underreported stories of today, the distortion of America's medical school education and training programs, as well as of medical science journals, scientific research, and the funding of that research, diluting them away from prioritizing excellence and best healthcare and diverting toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a political and social ideology rather than focusing on best medical science. This is a dangerous trend that threatens the quality of America's doctors and ultimately the future of medical care access and quality for everyone. And remember where we are today briefly in this era in the wake of the pandemic, which of course changed everything. And why did it change everything? Because the mismanagement of the pandemic exposed something that we were sort of gradually aware of, a massive across-the-board institutional failure. It was the most tragic breakdown of leadership and of ethics in health and medicine particularly that free societies have seen in our lifetimes. And remember, the virus did not cause lockdowns. Human beings decided to impose lockdowns, and they failed to stop the deaths and the spread, and they further inflicted massive damage on children and literally killed millions of people. Faith in health agencies has especially plummeted after that experience. More rapidly since 2019 than any other government institution, with almost 2/3 of Americans now rating FDA and CDC as, quote, only fair or poor. Half of America no longer has much confidence in science itself. The loss of trust, particularly in health and medical science, is part of the disgraceful legacy of those who held power during the pandemic. It's no surprise that trust in institutions declined, but trust in personal doctors and hospitals also dropped precipitously, from 71% in 2019 to 40% today. This erosion of trust stems partly from doctors failing to question public health guidance that lacked scientific evidence, some even defying common sense, and simply spewing out guidelines to their trusting patients. Remember, physicians hold a unique position in society as they interact with individuals during their most vulnerable moments, but they're also unique because doctors are granted essentially blind trust by patients. And that trust is granted in part because medical care and medical science are deemed esoteric knowledge. And of course, it's unreasonable to think that non-medical people have the time or the means to sift through medical science research or textbooks. But that degree of trust presents a tremendous ethical burden of responsibility on us doctors. Such trust is based on two critical assumptions by patients. The physician has a keen ability and a commitment to use critical thinking. And secondly, the physician operates with a highly ethical compass. No doubt disruption is sorely needed. And this evening, I think many people in the country, and I found out when I spoke in London about a week ago, many people in the world are basking in the fact that America elected the most disruptive leader in political history, President Donald Trump. The problem with that is that some I sensed are already feeling a little complacent, as if problem solved. President Trump is elected. And I do believe, and we have seen it's true, that the new administration is already working to unravel this destructive, overtly discriminatory diversity, equity, inclusion agenda that has intruded into America's universities, government, and even private sector. But tonight we're here to discuss something that is less spoken about. To me, one of the most corrosive and dangerous impositions of DEI, the influence of that ideology on America's healthcare, first in medical school admissions, but also as a taught social agenda in medical education, in physician training, in delivery of clinical care, and in medical science research funding. This is unrecognized. It's a scandal, and it will severely damage trust in doctors, even more so than we see today, and rightfully so. If it's continued, this promises to lower the quality of America's doctors, and it will lead to discriminatory delivery of medical care. This is something wholly antithetical to any ethical society. Well, with that, I'm going to take the pleasure of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb. Dr. Goldfarb is the leading voice on this important issue, and really one of today's most important and courageous whistleblowers, I will call him. As mentioned, he's a physician. He's the former Associate Dean of Curriculum at University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He is the founder and chairman of Do No Harm, which is a group that states among its purposes, quote, to protect patients, physicians, and healthcare itself from radical, divisive ideology. His work at Do No Harm is writing, speaking, testifying to Congress, and working with legislators, alerting the public and policymakers to these harmful trends in medical school and the results that we can anticipate of biased delivery of medical care. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Goldfarb.
Good evening. I didn't have a chance to print this out, so I'm going to use my computer, so please excuse me for that. Just take a second to power up, as you're all familiar with. Great. Well, good evening. When I was introduced as a celebrity, this has been the first time in my life anyone ever called me that. I'm really quite taken aback, but thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I'd like to thank Dr. Atlas for this invitation. It's a little loud here. And for the opportunity to speak with you about the future of medical education. But I'd like to first lay out some ideas about how medicine should be taught and practiced in the ideal world. Then we can consider what might actually occur. I've said many times that I believe that the academic medical center is really the heart of medical care in the United States. Unlike some professions like law, where the gap between the actual performance of legal services and the education of lawyers is quite large, academic medical centers and their associated medical schools now are the main engine of medical innovation and medical practice in most large communities. They have become very powerful as they have consolidated several hospitals into their networks. They have focused on contracting with insurance companies and even with the federal government to maintain their status, and they employ most of the physicians in a particular region. While the cost of healthcare is a crucial issue for our country and a driver of much of the activity in academic medical centers, there is also a moral imperative which should concern these powerful institutions. Franklin Roosevelt, in his speech in January 1941, almost a year before America entered World War II, but in a year that saw a great threat to Western civilization, articulated what he called the four freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. In many ways, our nation essentially pursued these goals, and through the force of arms, allowed much of the Western world to enjoy the benefits of these freedoms. I think we need a similar agenda in American medicine. I propose that we work closely with academic medical centers and with governmental entities to achieve the following 4 freedoms for the American people in the realm of healthcare. First, the freedom from substandard medical care. This freedom will require recruiting only the best and brightest individuals to become those who deliver healthcare to the American people. Merit must be the only criterion for that privilege, and we can talk about how that has decayed over the last few years. Next, the freedom from corruption of the scientific enterprise. Increasingly, medical science has devolved into an enterprise where political ideology holds as much sway as seeking the truth. NIH grant making should not be the playground for politically driven research initiatives, but it is today. Next, the freedom from gender ideology infecting medicine. We can be tolerant of adults' choices and lifestyles while protecting children from increasing efforts to take advantage during childhood and adolescence of a period of self-doubt and confusion into a medicalized and even surgical approach to altering their physical appearance. Finally, we must guarantee the freedom from public health authoritarianism. If there is a true hero of this concept, of course, it is Dr. Atlas, who, along with his colleagues at Stanford, including Jay Bhattacharya, fought against a horrific set of public health orthodoxies, even when clinical data showed them to be inimical to the health of the American people. We must create mechanisms to prevent any such recurrence. This is a big list, and one that requires partnerships between healthcare authorities, practicing physicians, academic medical centers, and perhaps most of all, professional societies. I hope as we discuss the future of medical education tonight, we can touch on some of these issues and how they may be implemented going forward. Thank you very much, and look forward to our discussion.
Okay, thank you. I assume this is working. Okay, good. And what I'd like to do here is first have some sort of dialogue and some questions and discussion, and then open it up to the floor. So I hope that people are ready with some good questions. And the first thing I want to talk about, let's start with medical school sort of admissions. Okay, because this is sort of the easiest topic to sort of quantify what's going on and what happened. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what's going on, particularly post the affirmative action decisions of the Supreme Court. But I'm looking here at the chart of the latest admission data on medical schools, and for about a decade, 56% of the class roughly is women. And we are at the point here where, this is the latest data, 52% of the population of admitted enrolled medical school is white, about 10+% black, 12% Hispanic, et cetera. And while I don't believe in anything about quotas, that it's really not that different from the population, except for this figure of it's sort of underrepresented white and underrepresented men. But I don't care about that. I think we should accept doctor applications for medical school on the basis of merit. But I'm sort of interested in what you're seeing and what you know about what's happened since the affirmative action decision, and because when I read websites and things, it seems to be all about sort of getting around that decision and instead of using merit for acceptance.
Well, let's sort of go back to the Students for Fair Admission decision, because this was about undergraduate education. It was a lawsuit predominantly by Asian students who were precluded from getting admitted to Harvard and North Carolina. Those were the two schools that were the object of the suit. And the issue there was that they were denied an opportunity to go to an elite school. But of course, there are a lot of elite schools. So one could make the argument that, yes, it was unfair. The Supreme Court decided that the 14th Amendment says that we're not going to treat anybody differently because of race, and therefore it's illegal to treat them differently because of race. That was Justice Roberts saying, if you want to get rid of racial bias and actions based on race, stop doing things based on race. Medical school is very different. There are 55,000 students who apply to medical school, and there are 22,000 spaces in medical school. So unlike colleges, where you could always go to another elite school, you come down here to Florida if you don't go to Harvard. But medical school, if you don't get into medical school...
We should say go to Harvard if you don't get into Florida, is what you really meant to say.
So be it. But medical school is different. So there we have the situation where you really are precluding people from becoming physicians. So that's point number one. So if you're going to decide to have an admission policy based on anything besides merit, you are immediately sacrificing merit. You cannot have anything that's based on anything but merit and have merit be maintained. That's impossible. And we actually know that the data, which are now are getting a little bit old, suggests that minority students were admitted to medical school back in the 2015, 2014 era. We're getting in with academic performance that was substantially below particularly Asian students. So for example, a black student who had below MCAT scores, that's the achievement test for medical school, and below average academic credentials, had an 85% chance of getting into medical school. An Asian student with those same academic achievements had a 12% chance. So clearly there was racial bias in who was coming into medical school. And to answer Dr. Atlas's point, when we still look at who's getting into medical school today, and we have very little data because these data have been, there's not been transparency, these data have been covered up really. But the schools that have reported the data, it's pretty much the same. Some have gotten better, some have gotten worse in terms of basing their admission data on academic achievement. Harvard is one that really has improved a lot, by the way, but they're obviously very much under the gun. Now, it seems to me that if you're going to take in people that are lesser academic achievements, the question is going to be, is that going to impair academic performance, and is it going to impair clinical performance later on?
Or if I can interrupt, the argument that a physical characteristic diverse doctor pool is beneficial for patients. That's part of the argument that's put forward, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was going to get at that, but thank you for that, yes. So that was the other side of the argument, but the question is, even doing what you're doing, are you impairing healthcare delivery, first of all, and then we'll answer the question secondly, are you improving the healthcare delivery for some groups of patients? And it's hard to get at this. It's hard to get at this, but what we do know is that performance, undergraduate performance and performance on medical college achievement tests does predict performance as a medical student, predicts grades in medical school. Grades in medical school and academic performance predicts the quality of training as a resident. Now, residency is, the 3 or 4 or 5 years after medical school where the actual learning of the craft of a particular specialty in medicine occurs. And we know now from 2 very large studies that minority students performing less well on the MCAT exam, performing less well as medical students, and we also know they're performing less well in residency groups. That's not to say there aren't some fantastic, talented people in the cohort of minority students that aren't doing very well, but there are students who are doing very poorly as well, so the group is pulled down. And we now know from a study by the American Board of Internal Medicine that your performance on licensure exams, which reflects your academic performance, predicts how your patients are going to do. There's a very large study done of a database in Pennsylvania to show that if you performed less well on the licensure exam, which used to be graded, that would predict how well you performed as a physician, whether your patients had a higher mortality rate, whether they were readmitted to the hospital once they were admitted. So we can make a fairly straightforward story that academic achievement as undergraduates predicts medical school performance, predicts training performance, predicts clinical performance. Now, we do know that minority groups tend to have lower academic achievement, period. Again, not as individuals, but as a group. So therefore, if you have a policy that's going to favor that group and say we're going to try to specifically go out of our way to recruit and retain minority students in medical school, you are putting the quality of physician care at some risk. At my school, the University of Pennsylvania, there's an arrangement that's been made, and I think it just has been stopped, actually, based on some of the executive orders, where out of 10 historically black colleges and universities, 10 students would be selected for each medical school class, would not have to take the medical college achievement tests, would only have to maintain a 3.2 undergraduate average, and would be admitted to Penn's medical school. Now, the idea was they're probably good enough. They're probably good enough to get through, but you know, when you're having that heart surgery, is good enough your goal? Now, as Dr. Atlas said, the other argument here as well, we need to have these minority students because people need to have a doctor that is of their same race, same ethnic background, what have you. And to me, the answer to that is, what are the data? What are the data on this? And in fact, this is a question that's been looked at over the last 25 or 30 years. People have been concerned about this issue. There are 5 systematic reviews of this issue. Systematic reviews are very structured analysis of the medical literature. Studies can only be included in systematic reviews if there's a control group, if the statistics are proper, and so on. And they have to be in peer-reviewed journals. So there are 5 of them. And a 6th one just came out. The 5 that were published, 4 of them show that there is no difference whether you have a black doctor and a black patient or a white doctor and a black patient. There's no difference with respect to communication skills. There's no difference with respect to any clinical outcomes. There aren't much clinical outcomes measured, but whatever they could measure, they couldn't show a difference. The one systematic review that showed a difference had ignored a bunch of papers that showed there was no difference. They should have been included, and they weren't included. They had been included in the other systematic reviews. A most recent systematic review was done of addiction medicine to see whether if an addict who was black had a black doctor, whether there was likelihood that they would be properly screened for HIV and would have other kinds and a better outcome from trying to treat their addiction. And the answer was no, there was no difference. So the only other argument then is a reparations argument. The reparation argument is historically blacks had been denied access to medical school. That's true. And the question is, should these reparations be carried on to today? And should the reparations be such that people with lesser academic achievements are admitted to medical school, even though it's not going to improve the health of the black community, but they're going to be admitted to medical school to make up for past discrimination. And of course, this was Ibram Kendi's notion that past discrimination requires current discrimination, and current discrimination is going to require future discrimination. This is never going to end. So that's the current situation. Now, and again, as I said, the little data we have is not much has changed in terms of the percentage of people that are being taken into medical school. What we need is real transparency. We need to know what the grades are of people that are being admitted to medical school. We need to know what their MCAT scores. We need to know what their academic performance is. If it's the same of all groups, fine. Then go ahead and do exactly what we're doing. If there's a substantial difference, as there has been in the past, then we're sacrificing the health of the American people for a political idea.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, to me, it doesn't strike me as common sense that patients would care about what the race of their doctor is as much as if they're good.
Yeah, no.
I mean, this shouldn't even have to be said. Is there any data on this?
Yeah, there are data. There's a famous study, the Oakland study, for which the principal investigator in the study got a MacArthur Award. And that study, the first thing they did, it's a complicated study, I won't go into all the details, but they showed black patients, this was done in Oakland, California, recruiting people out of barbershops and getting them to come to a clinic. And they showed them a picture of who their doctor might be. And there was absolutely no desire to have one doctor or another. They just want to be told, these are good doctors. Does it matter to you who you have? And when our organization has carried out a poll, over 860 black people, asked them, do you want a physician that looks like you, or do you want the best physician available? 70% of them said they wanted the best physician who was available. And that's pretty good in the poll. So, I think black people want the best doctor. They want the best health care. And that's what they want, and that's what they deserve.
Yeah, I want to move on a little bit to what's being taught, okay? Because it's one level to talk about who's admitted. I mean, that's an argument I think that's been around for quite a while. But I think what the unknown story is what's being taught in medical school. And I'm going to start with some quotes from the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, which is the official accrediting agency of medical schools, as well as the residency programs, and it has a lot to do with the hospitals that are affiliated with medical schools. First of all, on their main page, they have 5 bullet points, and one of them is called Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it says the AAMC is committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is on their main page. We develop strategic initiatives to cultivate a diverse and culturally prepared workforce, advance inclusion, excellence, imbue equity-mindedness, and enhance engagement with local communities. And then when you go into their new strategic plan, 10-point plan of the AAMC, number 1, strengthen medical education, and under there is learners are educated in a more inclusive and anti-racist environment that equitably supports the progress of all learners. The second of the 10-point plan is support students, and then in that they list, will complete a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment of all AAMC programs. That's all your residency and training programs. The third of the 10 bullet points on the strategic plan, focus on inclusivity. That's its own bullet point. 4, diversify tomorrow's doctors. Number 9 is promote health equity and health justice. And the problem isn't that these may or may not be good goals. That isn't the discussion, really. The problem is, what is the focus of medical school training? And should it not be on excellence of patient care? And similarly, this DEI sort of advocacy is permeated now through all the NIH training grants. I just looked it up actually using one of the AI tools in my hotel room, and of the NIH funding, there's $1.5 billion a year that is specifically for DEI research or for hiring faculty on the basis of skin color. I mean, these are things that have nothing to do with medical care at all. And so we have a situation that's sort of a little bit out of control in a general sense, but particularly, I think, frightening when you hear, as I'm going to ask you, what is being taught in the medical schools about this sort of social agenda. And I'll give you an example of how this is actually in play, by the way. My mother-in-law, who lives in Chicago, is 97, and she was 94 when the vaccine came out for COVID. 94 years old is a high-risk group for COVID, if anyone is. And in Chicago, that was not in the high-risk group, okay, because it was allocated by race. And so I had to fly her down to what is called the Free State of Florida to get the vaccine here as a 94-year-old. So I'm just saying, this stuff has real-world healthcare delivery issues. So I would like to hear and have the audience hear more about what kind of stuff is actually being taught in the residency training programs, in the medical schools, et cetera. And by the way, replacing clinical care excellence, medical science, et cetera.
Yeah, you know, Brown University Medical School, which is a very fine medical school, had a blurb that we uncovered at Do No Harm, that they were the criteria for hiring the next faculty member they were going to hire. And clinical excellence was lower on the list than, understanding DEI principles. They actually listed a grading of what was more important to them, which was really quite extraordinary. Yeah, I think the difficulty is, let's even go back a step. The clinical problem that they say they're addressing is the fact that there are healthcare disparities. Black individuals, black communities have worse healthcare outcomes. And when they try to study exactly what that's due to, they end up not being able to explain it. Usually they can explain a lot of it based on economic status and other kinds of things, obesity, things that you can capture in the medical record. But they're always left with a gap. And the conclusion was that gap represents physician bias. That was the conclusion. So here we don't know what's wrong. That's what the story must be. It must be physician bias. And the evidence for that has been the use of a very flawed psychological test, the implicit association test, which is a terrible test. It's unreproducible, and yet when you read the medical literature on this, they keep referring to outcomes using that test to say, yeah, physicians are biased. And the test is a terrible test, useless. So that's been the basis for the approach that, well, we've really got to do things. We've got to change our medical curriculum because that's a big problem in our communities. In most academic medical centers, particularly up in the North, Midwest, they're in large cities. They have large urban populations. They have many black patients that they treat, and that's a concern. So it's a real concern. What can we do about this? So the decision was made, we've got to train our medical students, we have to train our residents how not to be racist, because that's what must be going on here. And in reality, they have absolutely no evidence that that's what's going on, that that's the basis for the healthcare discrepancies, and yet that's the decision made. So most medical schools have decided we are going to embed this idea of anti-racism, tell the students how biased they've been, tell them how biased the medical establishment has been. And again, historically, yes, the Tuskegee experiment that was done was terrible and did represent bias, but that was now 70-something years ago. And we're a very different country today than we were 75, 80 years ago or more. But yet that's what the students are being taught. So once you decide that that's the problem, then you can imagine the sort of curriculum that you have to come up with. You have to teach them what's going on in the community. They have to spend much more time worrying about violence in the community. They have to spend more time figuring out how they can increase salaries in the community, all kinds of things that have absolutely no agency that physicians might have, and have absolutely nothing to do with being able to treat sick people. And yet this is what's been done. So even in my medical school at Penn, when I was still running the curriculum, we did have a course in how students should be professional, how they should be empathetic to patients' problems. We brought in people from the community to speak with them. I think they got a pretty good idea what was going on in the community, but the issue was, what can they do to care for patients? And unfortunately, now it's been put on steroids, if you will. There's much more time spent on these issues. Many more courses are devoted to these issues, and it's pounded into the students' heads over and over again that the reason that the black community has healthcare disparities is because of racism on the part of physicians. My primary care doctor has to spend 8 hours a year in what he calls it trauma training at Penn, where he gets to be told that how biased he is and how terrible he is as a human being, and that racism is the basis for healthcare discrepancies. Well, what is the basis for healthcare discrepancies? Mostly it has to do with patient factors. Mostly it has to do with patient factors. Now, those patient factors are tied up in socioeconomic issues. For example, the black woman who's pregnant, she has 2 children, she's working 2 jobs to keep her head above water and to take care of her family, doesn't have time to get the kind of prenatal care that she needs. It ends up that black women get to in first trimester prenatal care a rate about 50% below white women. And having that problem leads to many, many more problems at the time of delivery. And that's part of the story of increased maternal mortality. Black men who have diabetes get amputations much more commonly than white men do. And yet when you talk to vascular surgeons, the first time the patient is seen, there's not much they can do to salvage that limb, and amputations become the problem. Databases that these studies have been used for do not capture these kinds of patient factors. And that is the biggest problem with the cause of healthcare disparities. It's not the only problem. Some of them are genetic, some of them are cultural, some of them, it's a very complicated issue. But it's the simplest thing has been to blame the doctor for being racist, and that's what's been driving the medical school curriculum.
So it's replacing other things that are being taught is part of this sort
Absolutely.
of...
When they go on rotations on surgery, on OBGYN, they're going to have a day of lectures on these racial issues, brought up all the healthcare disparities, and told again how they need to be anti-racist and what they need to do to purge themselves of these kinds of feelings. And it occurs in every course. It's been embedded throughout the medical school curriculum. And one of my colleagues, Jay Green, who's done some analysis of this, has looked at the mission statement of medical schools. And if you look at the mission statement of medical schools around the country using artificial intelligence as a way of gathering all this information up, you can see this big switch that occurred around the time of the pandemic to go from talking mostly about the mission statement is to train highly excellent clinical scientists to one that's highly aware of racial issues and anti-racist physicians. The language has changed and the thinking has changed throughout medical education.
Yeah, and I think this is also seen in the medical journals. Okay, these are the best medical journals in the world have become editorialized, politicized, writing opinion pieces and talking about these kinds of issues, which, regardless of what the issues are, that's not the focus of a medical journal. And I think we have watched the pendulum swing very, very far, and I'm hopeful, as I'm sure many people are in this room, that we're going to start seeing that go back. Speaking of what's being taught to medical students, I mean, there are loyalty oaths and things in medical school. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the amazing ones is to look at the University of Minnesota Medical School pledge that they had the students who get their white coats for the first time. It's called the white coat ceremony. It's conducted around the country. First year medical students come in, their parents are there. It's a wonderful occasion. They come up on stage, they're given a white coat to wear for the first time. They're given a stethoscope. Now they're going to go play doctor someplace, which is another part of the problem. and usually send them out to a community clinic on day one of medical school, which I thought was truly insane, but that goes on. But at that ceremony, which is on the internet, they go through this land acknowledgement that is just beyond belief. Tribes you've never heard of were acknowledged, and they talk about how they need to rid themselves of any of their racist characteristics as medical students, and it's just a total, it makes a joke out of the Hippocratic Oath, which is what that ceremony is supposed to be, where they pledge their allegiance to patients, and they pledge their allegiance to their fellow physicians, and they pledge their allegiance to the scientific method and to the scientific principles that are going to guide their care. Instead, they're pledging allegiance to this idea that they're racist.
I want to talk, before I take audience questions, a little bit about the solutions to what's going on. And it's not just exogenous to the doctors, by the way. It's part of their whole lobbying effort. The AMA is all in on this. I get the AMA email newsletter all the time. And the AMA, it's not most doctors, by the way. It's only about 17% of doctors are part of the AMA, but they speak as if they're speaking for all doctors. All the subspecialty organizations, they're all repeating and have been what I call captured by this sort of ideology, and they feel it's very important to be outspoken about it. But the solutions are complicated, and this is really what Do No Harm has been really impactful at. Before I ask for your, just a few words on what some of the solutions are that I think, and it goes with solutions to other things, for instance, censorship on university campuses. The universities, the medical schools in the United States are private or public. They're funded by the taxpayer. And this is sort of underappreciated, but even just in the NIH grants alone, okay? I mean, the first statement is the government has no money, it's taxpayer money, that's Margaret Thatcher, but it's true. But the NIH, which has about $45 billion operating budget a year, about 15 or 20 academic medical centers get over $500 million of NIH funding every year. $500 million every year. That's taxpayer money. And you know, the essence of scientific research is the free exchange of ideas. So if you're not doing that, it's sort of fraudulent. You're posing as doing good science. You shouldn't be getting any taxpayer money. I've actually proposed that. We'll see what happens. But you did notice that the Trump administration is not shy in withholding grant money. They just withheld $400 million from Columbia for the anti-Semitism stuff going on. But the other, so they have to be accountable, and I think they have to be accountable to the curricula. You know, the people who are, the money from medical school tuition and things, a lot of it comes from taxpayer money. So you know, we can't allow these things to happen once they've been exposed. And I think this is really critical work that Dr. Goldfarb is doing with Do No Harm. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your work with legislators and other things that are really very impactful, in addition to testifying and educating people in Congress, because even the doctors in Congress, and I've spoken to them many times, they really don't have a deep knowledge, period, but they don't have a deep knowledge on any of this stuff. So we have to keep educating them. But go ahead, you're working quite a bit with them.
Yeah, so the approach we've taken has really been threefold in Do No Harm. And our website is donoharmmedicine.org. We'd love you all to sign up. There's no cost to sign up. It's an information source and has lots of interesting information, I think. So we've taken a three-pronged approach. The first approach is to come to places like this and try to inform the public as much as possible. I've been on all sorts of TV shows. I was on with Dr. Phil, even with Dr. Ben Carson, along with a couple of other physicians. I'll go any place and talk to anyone as an opportunity to do this. We've had a lot of op-eds in newspapers and Wall Street Journal and others. So we've tried that to inform the public. But in reality, this is a place for two aspects of tools that we might use. One is the legal aspect. We have about, I think there's been 18 lawsuits now, if I'm counting them up, where we've sued organizations that had discriminatory practices. I'll give you one example. Pfizer, big company, had a fellowship program that precluded whites and Asians. It brought people into the company, gave them educational benefits, really good job, mentoring, all sorts of things. Whites and Asians need not apply. And we sued them in federal court because the 14th Amendment says that you can't do that sort of thing. All of these racial programs that you encounter, NIH has a bunch, they're all illegal. They are all illegal. And that was the basis for the Students for Fair Admission case, and it will be the basis for many, many more cases going forward. So we've done a lot of that. But finally, it's in the legislative arena. Now, I, for one, am not thrilled with the government getting into medical care. And we can talk maybe a little bit about the so-called gender-affirming care and the government's role there. But we feel very strongly that this is an example where the government has to come in, and it's not preventing people from speaking about these issues. Students and faculty can talk all they want about this issue. The problem has been they're not allowing any other view to be presented. That's the difficulty. And, you know, there are just scores of individuals who have been canceled, call it whatever you want, told not to speak, afraid to speak. You know, causing people to be fearful of speaking is just as bad as actually doing something to shut them up. And that's what's gone on in medical schools. And our view of it, the only way to stop that at this point, because it's so entrenched in medical schools around the country, are laws that say you can't do that in medical school. You can't have a DEI office. You can't have an office whose goal it is to deal differently with different groups of people based on their racial identity. Number two is you can't hire consultants to bring in to sessions where the faculty, like my primary care physician, are trapped for 8 hours to hear about the trauma that they've inflicted through their racism. You have to tell the public, particularly in states that have public medical schools, like many of the Big Ten schools in the Midwest. University of Florida has a number of public medical schools. You must have transparency about who you're admitting and how you're admitting these people. So we've had laws that have been in various stages of passage. We just had one passed in Ohio that says no DEI activity in higher education. Because when we've gone to legislatures and said, we'd like to see you do this sort of thing in medical schools, they've said, why don't we just do it across the board in higher education? Why should it be confined to medical school? So the Ohio bill, where I got to testify before the Ohio legislature, is one that precludes DEI. Now, how do you preclude DEI? Well, first of all, you get rid of the infrastructure. When there isn't someone there in the school who's pushing these awful ideas, setting up these training sessions, having these training sessions for the faculty, putting these in all the courses, that dramatically reduces the activity. And hopefully, the kinds of executive orders that have come out from the government have put a chill on this to a certain extent as well. And we've been involved in crafting some of those orders. But the executive orders are not enduring. Understand
I'm
that.
also a little bit, if I may interrupt, a little bit concerned that what we see is people just relabeling themselves, because it's easy to say, no, I'm now in human resources, or whatever you want to say. There are, I think something that I sort of mentioned in my remarks about this idea that a problem solved, Donald Trump is elected kind of mentality. Yeah. No, the people that are doing these other things, whatever they are, they don't give up. They don't just walk away. They don't say, oh yeah, no problem, okay, we're done. No, it's not that. And I think it's very important to keep involved. None of these things have gone away or lessened, even though there are efforts, and we see private corporations, for instance, pulling back on DEI programs. Go ahead.
Yeah, our organization is a membership organization. We have over 16,000 members now. And a lot of what we've done has been through tips and information that we've gotten from insiders. So one of the things that you're going to see is follow-up lawsuits and follow-up investigations. And some places really have fired their DEI staffs. Other places have renamed them. They call it community excellence and all kinds of verbiage that covers it up. But at the end of the day, what we're going to do is the same thing that has been done for a long time, is look for a disparate impact. See if we're seeing a continuation of patterns that we know about up until this point, particularly about who's being hired as faculty members, who is being admitted to medical school. That will be a clue whether schools have changed much. I can tell you, though, that if you go online, which we've done, and looked at medical schools around the country, whether they've taken down their DEI offices, as the president's executive order said, most of them have totally ignored it. So it's going to require follow-up lawsuits. We have lawsuits planned against major medical schools, and it's going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. They're going to have Department of Justice investigations. This is a marathon. This is not going to go away. Dr. Atlas is completely right about this. And if we want to have a healthcare system that really is free of identity politics and focuses on the best and the brightest to have the opportunity to be physicians, we're going to have to fight this for many years to come.
Should we go into the gender-affirming care, gender transition, and then open it up for questions? I want to enter that topic with asking about you have a proposal on sort of a Bill of Rights, I think you call it. Why don't you explain what that is?
Well, as you all know, this idea that children who demonstrate confusion about their bodies when they're particularly young girls now has been, most of them have decided that they're very uncomfortable in the way they look, the way they act, their future, any sexual feelings they may have. They're confused about these. What's happened in this country, what's happened really around the world, is many of these children have ended up in situations where the social media and then the schools and then even the healthcare system has promoted their transition so-called transition to another gender. They're trying to transition to another sex. That's impossible. The sex that they have is the sex that they have. And our view about this, and the view of many, is that this is something that adults have engaged in for many centuries. This is not a new phenomenon of people feeling like they didn't like the way they looked, they didn't like the people that they had social interactions with or sexual interactions with, and they wanted to look differently and act differently and be different. And we feel like adults have that right. Children have no idea what they're doing. Children are unable to give informed consent regarding this, and therefore the only rational approach to this whole issue is that children not be allowed to undergo these radical procedures. They get medications that stop them from going through puberty. They get medications that start to change their secondary sex characteristics, where they have facial hair, widening of hips, breast development, and so on. All these are changed, and many children will even have surgical procedures, particularly so-called top surgery, where they take young girls' breasts and remove them.
Let me just interrupt and explain something that I'm not sure everybody understands. It is impossible to do any procedure on a minor without an adult informed consent, signing off on it. I'm talking about removing an ingrown toenail. I mean, the most minor medical procedure. It is not legal, or is certainly not standard of care legal, to have that child agree to something alone. It's an adult world informed consent.
Right, except the problem is that the children are the ones who start this process, and unless they're willing to go through it, their parents are certainly not going to be willing to have them go through it for the vast majority of cases. But the dynamic that occurs is the children show up at home. Just imagine a dinner. The child comes home, says to the parents, I want to change. I want to be a boy. A young girl says that to the parents. Fighting erupts. Everybody's unhappy. Finally, they calm down a little bit after this, and they go to the pediatrician. And they say, look, what's going on here? The pediatrician then refers them to a gender clinic. They go to the gender clinic, and the gender doctor tells the parents, look, unless you let your child go through this procedure, this process, your child will likely commit suicide. That's what they're told. Now, just imagine that you know, any of you that have children, know children, that you're told that your actions will now determine whether your child commits suicide. That is as coercive as anything can possibly be. And that's what's really going on. And that continues to be a theme that's portrayed out there, even though the literature on this, the medical literature on this, is very clear that these children do not commit suicide in any higher rates than any other child that has psychological problems at their level have. So in other words, a child that's depressed versus a child that's depressed and has gender dysphoria, they have the same risk of committing suicide. So it really isn't a problem that leads to suicide, but it's a problem in which suicide has been used to coerce parents. So Dr. Atlas is right, the parents agreed to it, but the child is really thinking that this is the right thing for them. The problem is the child is forcing their parents, and even to the point where they're seeking kinds of care outside the home, they're seeking care at their school, they're undergoing social transition, for example, where they cut their hair and change the way they look and get called by a different pronoun, get called by a different name outside the home, and in some cases the parents don't even know about it. So our organization has taken this on, and to me the big rationale for us taking this issue on, as many groups have taken it on, particularly mothers that have organized themselves after their children have had to go through this kind of thing. Because to me, it's another example of identity politics. These children are showing up at pediatricians' office and in gender clinics and are immediately being told, you're a trans kid. We're putting you in that box. We're not treating you as an individual, finding out why you feel this way, how we might get you to feel differently about your normal bodily functions, but rather just assuming that this is the right path for these children and starting them down a pathway that often leads to a problem. Now, Dr. Atlas talked about our Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights is for detransitioners. So we think, we don't know the numbers exactly on this, because once children decide they don't want to continue on going through this transition, they want to stop taking hormones, even after they've had surgical procedures, they want to change, and go away from this and live their normal lives, which we know that the vast majority would do if left alone and allowed to go through puberty and allowed to become adults, they would be fine. They might be gay. There's a higher incidence of them being gay, but they'd be living normal lives. And instead, we find that they're being altered in this way and being treated this way. And so the detransitioner Bill of Rights is to support these children that have decided to detransition. If a child goes to a doctor now and says, I want to stop these hormones and I want the problems that they produced be reversed, there are no medical codes that say that the physician can put down that can lead to a legitimate billing for those services. And often the physicians are just really aren't willing to see these children, the physicians that started them down this path in the first place. And we also think that, going back to this issue of informed consent, that in fact, the parents were coerced into these procedures, the children didn't understand what they were getting into, and that they need the right to sue the practitioners and the healthcare hospitals or healthcare systems that put them through this. And right now, medical malpractice is a very short window for that to occur, a few years after the procedures are done. But these children, it may take them 10 or 15 years to realize what terrible errors they made and how they were coerced into doing something they really didn't want to do and weren't happy with. So the bills also allow for this much longer period of lawsuits that will allow them to get compensated for what they've been through. And there are about 50 such lawsuits going on around the country. So we think this may be as high as somewhere between 30 and 50% of the children that start down this path we know want to detransition, so-called detransitioners, somewhere within 5 to 10 years of after starting this path. We have no idea how many go for further periods in that. And so our detransitioners Bill of Rights, which is being introduced around the country, will allow this to go on in states that have already declared that these procedures can no longer occur. And there are 25 states now in which this so-called gender-affirming care on children, particularly the surgical care in almost all of them, and in many of them, the use of puberty blockers, which prevent them from going through puberty, and some of them preventing these sex hormones from being applied to children. So I think it's 26 states now have such laws, and we're trying to introduce the detransitioner Bill of Rights in many of these states.
And a lot of the countries that are our peer nations in Western Europe are pulling back from this whole area and coming out with data that, again, countering this suicide narrative, et cetera. So the U.S. Is actually off base, sort of off the rails, I like to say, with a lot of these things. So we're hoping that some of the sanity will be restored by the new administration, frankly, and a different feeling in the public as more and more awareness is facilitated by getting rid of the censorship and the cancel culture that has been so harmful to hearing the truth, frankly.
Yeah, Dr. Atlas mentioned something about the journals. The New England Journal has had two sort of editorials recently, as if the last 4 years, where Britain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark have all decided that they're not going to allow these procedures on their children after looking at their data that they've accumulated over several years. After the United States has had multiple studies that have come out to show the fact that the suicidality is not really an issue, to show that the mental status of these children isn't improved. Despite all that, the AMA, the American Pediatric Association, the American Board of Internal Medicine, the American College of Physicians, they've all come out, the AAMC, they've all come out in support of this idea that this so-called gender-affirming care is required, it's life-saving, and that it should be applied to children throughout the country. So this is a real example of the medical societies standing in the way of practicing good medicine that's practiced now in many parts of the world, but not in the United States.
Okay, I'd like to take some questions from the crowd. We have roving microphones here.
I was very interested. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. I was very interested in the statistics you gave at the beginning, where you said something like 55,000 applicants, 22,000 were accepted, therefore 33,000 weren't. I believe in the year 2000, the U.S. had 30 million people who were over 65. The number today is 60 million. It's a 3% growth rate. By 2050, it's going to be 90. By 2075, it's going to be 120. You can calculate the growth rates. If you take the number of doctors that graduate from medical school and you subtract the 11,000 that retire every year, the increase is less than 1%. Our family has some experience. My father was a doctor. My uncle was a doctor. All three of my cousins were doctors. My brother's a doctor. His wife's a doctor. And then the next generation are all doctors. When they get together, they complain about one thing, that the medical profession is controlled by older people and they're restricting the supply and demand. You had an Apple computer there, you don't have any trouble increasing supply and demand. We are on the verge of most people here can't even get to see a doctor, and we're not increasing them. I'm not saying the DEI discussion is irrelevant, it's highly relevant, but there's, it's almost like Rome is burning and we're fiddling here, because there's a massive undersupply of doctors. I'd love to see what that top quartile is of the 33,000 that didn't get into medical school, how qualified they might have been.
Yeah, it's a great point, although separate, really. I think that there is a clear doctor shortage, both primary care, but actually more specifically than that, even in the specialties, including simply surgical fields and things like this. It has been well known, well documented. In fact, a lot of the best charts are from the AAMC that I mentioned, and I've talked about this for quite a while. The question is what to do about it, and there are several solutions besides there's a multiple cost problem here. Number one is there is a monopoly control of doctors by doctors, okay? And I could give you all the data on this, but they don't want competition. I'm painting with a broad brush. I've written pieces about doctors should put their prices forward. I've never gotten as much hate mail, although that was pre-COVID. There's good data. For instance, primary care. Okay, there's very good data that most primary care is relatively simple medicine, and it is the same outcome if you are administered primary care by a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant than a primary care doctor. That's in the literature. It's been known for more than a decade, and it's about 30 to 40% cheaper. So there are practice constraints and all kinds of state-based constraints restricting care that can be given by non-MD health professionals. And this is, by the way, a topic in almost every day in the Journal of the AMA. This is the primary concern besides salary. Another one is this idea that nurse practitioners and physician assistants can expand their practice. So there is a monopolistic control over the supply. The second part, as you mentioned, I think, is this. I ran the fellowship program at Stanford University Medical Center for 11 or 12 years. It took me 3 years to increase by one the number of training positions. Okay, that is due to not just bureaucracy, but that is intentional control by the subspecialty fields on how many doctors are produced, and it's all about supply and demand. So yes, doctors are sort of one of the more unhappy careers where their burnout rates are high and all this kind of stuff, but on the other hand, they don't want, as a group, the competition. So we need to break that monopoly. The other part is there's a lot of archaic restrictions on doctor licensing. Okay, we all know, I think, in this room that the licensing is controlled by the state. There's no difference between the doctor qualification in Florida and California. I'm not saying they're not better here. But, this is insane that we're using this sort of individual state control of medical licensure. All that does is restrict practice because a lot of medicine can be practiced by distance, by telehealth. We saw that during the pandemic. For different reasons, but that was done. And so there are all kinds of things that could increase the supply of doctors as well as other parts of the healthcare system. And the biggest obstruction is the medical field itself, in my opinion.
There's also another source, and that is foreign-trained doctors. So of those 22,000, there are 35,000 residency positions available each year. So a third of them, of the positions, are filled by foreign-trained doctors. So that's another source. And then you get into a question, well, who are they? What are their capabilities? How well-trained are they? And some of them are wonderfully trained, others are less well-trained. And then, of course, there's a whole group of osteopathic physicians that are being trained. That's another source. So the numbers aren't quite as bad as you said because of these other sources of physicians as well. There's another real problem about the MD training in this country, and that is that it's, in order to have a medical school that's accredited, the students have to have a very robust clinical experience. So you can't just put 50 students on a surgical rotation in which 10 procedures are done a day, let's say. They're not going to get to see anything. They're not going to get to do anything. So the requirements of medical schools are such that they're endlessly looking for more clinical training positions. If they had more clinical training positions, then they would, I think that they would take on more medical students. Many of them, it's another tuition that they could get. So they, in terms of the supply, they would increase their class sizes. But we've doubled the number of medical schools in the last 30 or 40 years. We've doubled the class size in each of the medical schools. But still, the numbers are there that there's an insufficient supply. You have to understand about, now 30 years ago, there was a big push to reduce the number of residency training positions because the medical world decided that the managed care model was going to take precedence and there would be much more control on physician access and that patients wouldn't ever get referred to specialists and we won't need any surgeons, we won't need any specialists, it'll all be done by primary care. That turned out to be a terrible idea. That was wrong. And some of the problems that we're dealing with today are a result of that, of the residue of that very bad thinking that went on then.
Any questions?
No, I just have a couple points I'd like to comment on. I think lastly, I think it's more, and always has been, a problem of physician maldistribution rather than the adequate number of physicians, because in your larger cities, there's plenty of physicians. It's the ones that don't want to go out to the more underserved areas. And I think a lot of older physicians who aren't really ready to retire or retiring or getting out because medicine's become a big business. Corporations have taken over medical practices. The hospitals are buying up medical practices, and doctors don't like practicing algorithmic medicine. I went to a school with a gentleman who both of us didn't get in initially because of affirmative action. He sued the Board of Regents of California, Bakke, and it was a famous case in 1978, which sort of alluded to what happened where they said, no, you can't have quotas, but you can in certain circumstances. Well, then and there again, that sort of shows that the lawsuit really didn't do a whole lot of good because they can wiggle around that type of thing with affirmative action, which they're doing with the DEI. And then to comment on a couple other things, I'm an associate professor of clinical medicine and surgery in Washington, D.C. I've just recently retired. But I was a professor at George Washington University and Johns Hopkins. And we took care of a lot of the inner city women. We ran free clinics, and I'm an obstetrician. So as far as prenatal care, we even sent out, and we got the city to raise money to bring these pregnant women to our clinic and come in, and a lot of them just, why should I go and see the doctor? Because if it's free today, it's free tomorrow. I'll go, I got other stuff to do. So they don't go. So I don't know that the resources are there, but they just don't want to come and do it. And as far as training residents, there's an all-black medical school in Washington. It's Howard. A lot of the patients would come up city, either into Georgetown or GW, because they don't want to see the Howard doctors because they didn't think they were as good. And in training some of these people, because I'm a clinical teacher, so I teach them how to operate, a lot of them don't want to stay. It's like 5 o'clock, I got to go. But if it's a case, you get a chance to operate. Yeah, I got other stuff to do, so give it to the next guy. So that desire for merit, to get better, to improve your skills, it's not there. And I think that's from a lot of the DEI people that have gone into medicine and affirmative action that, and I know that there was a couple people that came to us from Georgetown, and how long were you in Georgetown? Well, I was there a couple years, longer than I should have. It took me longer to pass through the basic sciences because it was tough. So when you're talking about curriculums, one would think that instead of this DEI, they should add courses like medical ethics. It's very well needed in medicine, and they don't teach that. And I think a lot of your lawsuits should be directed towards the boards of medicine, because it's the boards that silence doctors like myself when we came out in support of Dr. Bhattacharya's Balfour Declaration, and I advised a lot of my patients not to take the vaccine and not to give it to their kids because there's no long-term data. There's no data. And you get censored by your own board of medicine. So recently there was a whistleblower in Texas with this affirmative care and gender care, and the question is, the board of medicine in Texas, if they're sued, they won't allow their doctors to do it, otherwise they should revoke their licenses. So shouldn't your focus be more towards the boards of medicine or whoever the...
Hey, let's see if he can answer that. That's a question.
Yeah, so, I'm obviously not a lawyer. Our organization works with some really good lawyers, including the ones that filed the case, the famous Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard and UNC. So we look at targets all the time. We are contemplating some lawsuits, particularly against the AAMC, because it has a monopoly over certain aspects of medical school activity. But
including the number of positions entering medical school class is sort of it's fixed on the basis of government supplement and AAMC. It's complicated. But
yeah, it is complicated.
It's not so trivial to increase that.
No, but I can just say that we're looking for targets all the time. From the legal perspective, you have to have standing. You have to have a particular issue that's in place. It may take individuals who are willing to stand up. Many of the individuals who have been harmed, they really don't want to make things worse for themselves in some cases. So it's hard to find plaintiffs, but that's what we do. That's what our organization does. It tries to identify the targets that are likely to yield success in these lawsuits, and that's what we're about. We've supported Dr. Haim, who's one of the who's the person you're talking about. We work closely with him. We work closely with a doctor at Johns Hopkins who was fired, pediatric cardiologist, because of making some comments on social media that were rather anodyne when all is said and done, and we've worked with him. So we do look to try to help, but there has to be a legal case, a legal basis for it, and it often gets to be quite technical as what the standing is.
It's unfortunate you have to wait for damage for somebody's harmed before you can file a suit.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any other question? Yes, this gentleman in the front row here. Second row. Sorry.
This is specifically for Dr. Goldfarb. Obviously, Do No Harm only has 14,000 members. What is the main thing that stops people, because there is such clear data, if there is clear data, what is the thing that stops people from changing their minds? What changed their minds in the beginning, right? What makes people continue to support DEI hiring if it's so obviously not working?
Yeah, well, then that's sort of a question for the social psychologists about why people feel that they should pursue this approach. I mean, one view is, I think there's a certain sense that people have about guilt, about the way the black community has been treated in the United States for a long time. I mean, they started out being enslaved. They were denied lots of opportunities for a long time. There are people who feel like reparations is a proper approach to take, that this is valid, and that that's the way they should organize their lives. That's the way the medical profession should organize itself. They truly believe this. I think they're wrong. I think most people don't feel like that's a valid approach, but that's the basis for it. And it's going to be hard to change the minds of people that have that mindset. You could even say it's a valid mindset. I think it's a wrong one, but that I think is the basis for most of it, because there is no objective evidence that this is going to benefit the black community. So if you're not benefiting the black community, then you're benefiting this small group of people, that black students that get to be doctors. And my view personally is nobody has a right to be a doctor. Everybody has to earn that privilege, and that's the way it should go. But I think that's the basis for it. Even many people in medical school, many of the medical school administration, they think this is the right thing to do, and that's why they do it.
And you could see that same kind of thinking. It is held by the majority of people now in the United States, and about DEI is not appropriate. I mean, I think that your question is a good one. It reminds me of my own son saying to me, "Dad, when I was first speaking about COVID in 2020 March, if you were right, if it was so obvious, then everybody would agree with you. Why doesn't everybody agree with you?" Which is a difficult question, although he now agrees with me finally. But you know, it's a reasonable question. But I think the hardest question to answer is why people think the way they do, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that.
There's also a second thing. I apologize, I'm hogging the mic. There's some discussion on like, okay, if the only thing a medical school is doing is accepting somebody who is like high potency, eventual like caretaker, like a caregiver, right? If someone's like, oh, I had a really high MCAT score, I'm going to therefore do a better job. Is that really the right way to do it? Or should the medical school be preparing everyone to do the same good job or the best job they could possibly do, right? Why does the responsibility fall onto medical school admissions and not on the actual like medical school classes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, again, the issue is what's been the performance of this approach to medical school admissions? And the data are that the performance has been a problem. So now the question is, how do you solve that problem? Do you decide, well, I'm going to try to solve the problem by putting more and more resources into medical school, tutoring, mentoring, bringing people up so that they finally succeed and are better? Or should the solution be, given the scarce resource of a medical education, which it really is a scarce resource, should we simply pick the most capable people? And again, that's a decision for society to make. If you ask society, what do you think about this? This solution should be, I think most people would say, but not everyone, yeah, the right thing to do is to pick the most qualified person. And remember, if you pick one person because of you want to elevate them, there's another person that you've just diminished. So there's a fairness problem here because of the fact that being admitted to the medical school is a scarce resource.
Well, and there's an outcome problem because, you know, the analogy is, or the thing that's always said is if I have a neurosurgeon, I have a brain surgeon, I don't care what they look like. I want the best possible surgeon. And I think we are a society that I think is based on merit. You want the best possible people to do everything, and the incentive is to become better. And so at some point, you know, when you've been through 20 years of education and all these years of training, at some point, merit should count. Yeah, when you're in kindergarten or elementary school or high school, we have a country that does a lot to try. And there's massive problems with our K through 12 education. There's no question. They're a disaster. But in terms of when you're going to be trained when you're 33 years old to do an aneurysm surgery, okay, at some point, you have to pick good people. I don't know anybody who doesn't want the best person to operate on their brain or their heart or fly the airplane that you're going to take.
And you know, to me, if you ask me, what's the biggest problem with DEI? The biggest problem with DEI is the brilliant black physician who is absolutely meritorious, is the best person in their field and is diminished because we have this regimen that's going around where black people are getting put in positions that may or may not be, may or may not have been justified based on their, in this case, academic performance. That is a tragedy. What you heard from the physician back there, black patients are coming from Howard and going up to, because they think that black doctors aren't good enough. Part of that is this
Just an assumption.
constant beat that's out there that this is DEI, this is why these people are here. So I think it undermines the black physician as well as undermining the quality of healthcare.
I have a little anecdote to go with that. The very famous black economist, I'm not going to say who said this, but he said in the 1960s he used to seek out a black doctor because there was so much racism that if somebody's black who's coming out of medical school, they got to be damn good. He said, and now he seeks out a white doctor. He will not take a black doctor because of the opposite problem that has been instilled. It's sort of it's an anecdote. It doesn't mean anything, but it sort of illustrates the issue a little bit. Is that it's very difficult now to just simply disregard race when race becomes the criteria for getting a job or a position. It's just a very complicated, slippery slope.
Considering how politicized so many things have become in society, particularly in recent years in the medical world, I'm wondering if there's any research on the political affiliation of the parents of young children who claim that they're in the wrong body. I'm sure, and I say this without knowing the research, but I'm sure that a study would find, say, among children with asthma, you would probably find they were randomly distributed in the population. Or children with diabetes, perhaps, or other diseases randomly distributed in the population. But yet, what's happened with this trans idea is become an epidemic among middle school girls in the last decade or so. So I wonder if there's any research about this.
I don't know that particular question.
Do you have a guess on their political party? No, I'm just kidding.
Let me tell you, I think this is an across the nation sort of problem. I don't think it's restricted to one socioeconomic group, and it's not restricted to, I think, one political party, frankly. I don't know that, but I think that's the case. Look, there have been transgender people for many, many centuries. We know that. And we also know that if you look at children that express gender dysphoria, let's say it used to be typically a little boy who wanted to dress up in dresses and was very effeminate, and that was the typical picture. And if you took a cohort of those children and allowed them to go through puberty and to become adults, about 85% of them then reverted back to accepting their original sex. And many of them were gay, about 50%, something like that, but they lived normal lives. What's happening now, as you said, is it's quite different. It tends to be much more young girls who never expressed any of this gender dysphoria. Suddenly it occurs. A lot of it is driven by social media, peer group. It happens in schools. This is what has been identified as this rapid onset gender dysphoria thing. And those are the ones that are particularly vulnerable. They're having a lot of psychological problems. They used to be eating disorders, and now it's become transgender kinds of initiatives. And that's why we feel so strongly about it, because it really does represent childhood confusion. But on the other side of the coin is, I said 85% go on and change, but 15% don't. So there is a cohort of adults who are living their lives this way. There's a member of Congress. There are legislators all over the country. And this is why we just have to be very empathetic, and we have to be understanding, and we have to not be biased against these people. It's not a question of bias. This is a question of children being protected from something that we know in the vast majority of cases damages them.
And that's irreversible in many cases. That's the other problem.
When I was in graduate school back in the 70s, studying DSM-3 at the time, gender dysphoria, of course, was a category of diagnosable mental condition, but it was also vanishingly rare. Demographically, it was vanishingly rare. So yes, you're right, it's always existed, but it's been rare. Now it's an epidemic. And something has happened to make it an epidemic, and I'm just wondering if that's connected to politics in any way.
Well, there is a lot of good data.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of data on that being a social contagion is the word. And I've heard presentations on this, but I'm not fluent in the data, or I would say it.
But just go back 25 years. Let's say a child did have this feeling. How were they going to communicate it to their friends? Were they going to get together at lunch and sit around the table? No. Now they're going home at night and they're going online and they're seeing something. And they're telling, their friend, "Gee, look what I just saw." When you talk to people that are deeply enmeshed in trying to combat this real epidemic, this is what you hear over and over again. And unfortunately, there are a cohort of adults, particularly in schools, that feel like, yeah, we need to do this. This idea that children know themselves. I have a little granddaughter at 3 years old. She thought she was a cat. She used to crawl around the floor. Children, they have no idea.
What did you tell her when she told you she was a cat? What did you say? Did you say, "That's great, sweetheart, that you're a cat"?
Ellie, you're a girl.
Right, you're a girl. Exactly.
And she's fine now.
Of course.
You didn't have the procedure. Any other questions? Go ahead, you could just give it to.
Here?
I think we need the mic somewhere over here.
Thank you very much. And I found coming here was very informative, and I appreciate your background and your eloquence in sharing your ideas. I'm sitting here, obviously, to me, in the minority, because I do embrace DEI to an extent, certainly more than is embraced here that I'm hearing. Nonetheless, I think we have to come into each other's spaces and hear what the whole gamut has to say. And what I would really appreciate, because I'm not the eloquent speaker, I would love to have people of different persuasions, different viewpoints, present at the same time so that we can really critically understand what's going on. Like when somebody with esteemed knowledge says something is wrong or bad or whatever, I would like somebody on the other side to say, well, this is how I look at it. And I know I look at DEI differently than most of you in this room. Not to say that that has to be the only criteria that we measure who gets into medical school, but I think maybe partly is not having the bars as high in every category. But I do think, I like going to a female obstetrician. It's just what I like. And I think sometimes the gender affirming argument comes down to, I was in education and I was hearing stories about teachers telling kindergartners, that, you could be a boy if you wanted to, even if you were a girl. And part of that came out of literature that was, the kids were being exposed to a book that the family had two gals parents rather than, a typical male and female parent. So, I just think we get our stories so extreme that all of a sudden I start painting one side with one brush and then the other side with another brush. And we really have to get everybody into this room, a mixed group.
I can say, I was on the Dr. Phil show. Let me go back to that, because I was on with Ben Carson. There were two other physicians, one who was a dean at of diversity, equity, and inclusion at a medical school, and one woman physician who was vice president of the NAACP, physician as well. There are 4 doctors. I suggest you go there and you will see the debate. We went back and forth. Ben Carson and I, and you'll get opposing points of view. I'd be delighted. I've sought out and been invited rarely to places where people felt very differently, and their attitude was, this is all nonsense, and what you're saying is all wrong, without any data, without any attempt to point to the literature, to point to studies, to point to analyses. So the other side has taken this as a matter of faith. And that's the way it's been. And my job, feel very strongly, is to make it a matter of data, make it a matter of observations.
But that's what the other side would say too. So
No,
I
but
guess-
they say
No,
it, but then you have to back it up.
Yes,
and that's the
exactly,
question.
Exactly.
So
But
but unfortunately, the effort here is one of going to source studies, looking very carefully at the literature. It's a hard job to do this, and I'd be delighted if someone wanted to approach it that way. It's not been the way it's been approached. And the argument has been, the AAMC comes out and says, the evidence is that this will improve the health of the black people. There is not a study that is really valid that shows that. Or if it shows it, there are 10 studies that show the opposite, and then that's ignored. And one study is held up as this is an example of it. Next time, I mean, I've gone that. You go and follow the source. They put references in, you follow the source back, and it's just not there. The data are not there to support these ideas. And go to our website. We've tried to make arguments when studies have appeared that have claimed differently to show how they're flawed and what the problems are with them. I'm delighted to argue the data, but that's the problem.
And I think the other side is delighted to argue the data as well. That's why I like the
Oh,
two
okay.
in one. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think a huge amount could be said about DEI. I'm a college professor, and I've been at several colleges and bounced around a bit, courtesy of DEI, which has not been very kind to people with diverse viewpoints. And so, with respect to the lady who was talking about DEI, I recommend reading some of the sources like D'Angelo and Kendi, who was brought up previously, and so on. And I think you'll find out more about it, some of which may surprise you. But anyway, I guess my question to you all was to try to get your take on, I think it's not just about merit in terms of selecting physicians, but also the fact that DEI can actually actively make people hostile to various groups. And so my concern is that I might actually encounter a physician who is genuinely prejudiced against me, courtesy of their indoctrination into DEI ideology. And so I'm kind of curious about your take on that.
That's exactly what I wanted to sort of bring out, what is being taught to these people, because in many cases it's almost racism that's being taught that will have a discriminatory sort of end result of the delivery of healthcare. And I think that is, it's not at all admission to medical school and affirmative action or quotas or anything. That's not the biggest problem. The big problem is the teaching of doctors to specifically prioritize people on the basis of race.
Yeah, there's again, going back to the data on this, so there was a wonderful study that was done at Rutgers University, just was published recently, looking at this very issue, because the approach that has been taken to DEI in terms of educating physicians as well as residents is to expose them to Robin DiAngelo, expose them to the ideas there. And the question is, what's the impact of that? So here was the study that was done. They took a bunch of people, a fairly large number, several hundred people, and they broke them up into two groups. One group was read a story about wheat farming. Another group was read Robin DiAngelo's some portions from her book, some portions from Kendi's book, and then they were asked to evaluate scenarios. So one of the scenarios, for example, was somebody is rejected from college. What do you think the basis for it was? The ones that were read the DiAngelo or Kendi materials about racism said, well, this is an example of racism. The ones that were read the story about wheat farming thought, well, I don't know why he didn't get admitted to college. Maybe he wasn't the best candidate. So in a way, this is exactly right. These CME courses that are devoted to getting rid of implicit bias. And now, for example, in Michigan, you have to take 2 hours of implicit bias training. They end up pissing everybody off who has to sit there for 2 hours and accept something that they don't believe in. But secondly, in a sense, they're altering the psychological outlook of these people, and they're preconditioning them to the idea that this is a real problem. Why is this bad? It's bad because if you want to fix healthcare disparities, which all physicians really would like to do, the answer is not to send the physicians to implicit bias training. The answer is to do the best outreach you can possibly do to communities so they have access to care. The answer is the best kind of education that you can do about health literacy in high schools and even elementary schools. This is the answer. I don't know if that is going to work. I don't know if that's going to work, but at least that's the kind of resources that should be devoted to trying to improve this situation instead of blaming the healthcare system, which is just sort of annoying everybody, wasting huge amounts of time, huge amounts of money, and not accomplishing anything.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I really normally speak about healthcare policy solutions, and we have an unconscionable second-class parallel healthcare system for poor people in this country, which is called Medicaid. And the outcomes for Medicaid patients, even what's called controlling for the patient, the outcomes for Medicaid patients are worse than for people who have private insurance. Nothing to do with the sickness of the patient. And the reason is because of the lack of, most doctors don't take Medicaid, half of doctors don't take Medicaid patients. Even of the half that do, about 25% of them don't when you actually follow up. This is a government study. They don't get allocation of the same number of medications, et cetera. So we've created and keep expanding a substandard healthcare system for poor people instead of helping them use money that they need subsidy for to access the same excellent healthcare that the rest of us do. So there's a lot of reasons behind healthcare disparities, and that has been sort of, there are fixes to it, but it isn't necessarily DEI training of doctors. It's not that doctors themselves are the racists. I don't think there's any evidence of that whatsoever. Next, any other question? Or? Okay, I think we're going to call it an evening. Thanks, Dr. Goldfarb, and thank you for the interesting questions.